Yes, good question. If you read it and you're not convinced, does that mean it's not true? I've actually told Mormons when they've asked me if I read it and asked God, and I said yes, and He showed me that Joseph Smith was not a prophet of God, they were startled, because I think they have to believe that either I wasn't sincere, because you have to be sincere, you can't be frivolous about that. They might have rightfully assumed that I already thought I knew what was true before I read it in the first place. So you really weren't open-minded. There's any number of ways that they could probably finesse the response. And of course, I told you my story before, where I asked a Mormon if he had read the Book of Mormon and asked God if it was true, and he said yes. I said, okay, well, here's God answering that prayer. It's not true. And I wasn't being facetious. I was trying to really shake him into considering the fact that, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but if you're going to ask God whether something is true, like a Book of Mormon or anything else, you need to be careful as to how you expect God to answer that question. That is, you need to consider, okay, suppose, let's just for the sake of argument, suppose that was a legitimate thing to do, which I'll challenge that anyway, but let's just grant it for the sake of argument, that it's legitimate to ask God to show you whether some book is from Him or not. You want to make sure that you don't already have some preconceived expectation as to how that would be answered. If you said something like, suppose I said, well, Lord, if the Book of Mormon is true, let the blue sky turn green for 30 seconds. And it doesn't. Well, not surprisingly, a Mormon wouldn't be impressed to go, well, you can't just stipulate to God something silly like, well, let the blue sky turn green and then that'll prove. Okay, well then that would be silly. But then if that's possible that I could stipulate an inferior or an inadequate criteria, if I can do that, then what other kind of criteria are people using that may as equally be as inadequate as expecting the sky to turn blue, or every light was green on the way? Now, some of us start feeling a little uncomfortable because I think a lot of us as Christians make decisions like that often. Lord, if you want me to do this, I couldn't believe that. Right after, man, I got a call. They called me right after that. I was just praying, It's like, well, is that the way the Bible says that we're supposed to make these decisions? Don't get me started. You didn't ask my opinion, so I won't give it to you. At least not while I'm on the clock. Are there problems with his story? Well, many of the critics, and by the way, before this is all over with, I will put up on the website a bibliography so you'll know what some of the primary sources are, and some good secondary sources that are pro-Mormon, like McConkie's book and Fielding Smith's book and others, so you can find the information. But also some Christian material doing the critique as to what I think is available out there. There's a lot of stuff. And the critics are quick to point out there are absolutely problems with this story from the very beginning. Joseph Smith Jr. supposedly had his vision in 1820. Yet a history of the church written in 1834 mentioned nothing about the visions. And the vision itself, the story, was not reported until 1840, that is, in any kind of official venue, and then was not published officially by Joseph Smith until 1842. Now, that doesn't make it false. But what we're going to discover is that there are actually versions of the story outside of some of these circles that it's a different story. The story apparently has several different versions. That's why Winwood says, the different, quote, descriptions. He's aware that the critics are saying, well, these aren't different descriptions. These are actually incommensurable stories. Joseph Smith Jr. claimed in a revelation, interestingly, in 1832, when he supposedly received the priesthood, that no one could see God without. That is, you can't see God without the priesthood. But yet he supposedly saw God back in 1820. He doesn't, by his own story, doesn't get the priesthood until several decades later, or more than a decade later. So you just go, okay, well, how were you able to see God back in 1820 if no one can see God without the priesthood, and you say you didn't get the priesthood until later on? An account of the vision, presumably the earliest, dated about 1833, was either dictated by Smith, I'm not really sure of the origin of it, to Frederick G. Williams, scribe to the prophet and counselor of the First Presidency, or written by Joseph Smith Jr. himself. It was denied to exist by church officials until it was published in a master's thesis at BYU by a man named Paul Cheeseman. I can get you the background information on all of this if you want. I'm just summarizing it from the resources in 1965. This version is now admitted to be authentic by such Mormon scholars as James Allen, Associate Professor of History at BYU. BYU is Brigham Young University, if you didn't know that, named after the second prophet and president of the church, Brigham Young. In their publication, Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. The reason it was suppressed is evidently because it contains significant differences from the, quote, official version. The 1833 version does not mention the Father appearing to Joseph Smith, as does the, quote, official version. The 1833 version says that Joseph Smith Jr. called upon the Lord and had the vision in the 16th year of age, but the official version has the vision happening in the spring of 1820. But since Joseph Smith Jr. was born in December of 1805, he would only be in his 15th year of life in the spring of 1820. So there's a discrepancy there in terms of, well, exactly how old were you? The 1833 version mentions nothing about religious revivals going on, yet the official version says a great deal about them. In fact, other critics have gone on to try to nail down from documentation from the religious groups that were in existence in that part of New York during that year, and there's no record at all of all these revivals going on during that period when supposedly all these revivals were going on. Well, none of these churches have any record that any of them were involved in any kind of revival during the time that you say that all these revivals are supposedly going on. In 1833 version, Joseph Smith Jr. says that before the visitation, he knew that all the churches were wrong. Yet in the official version, Smith says that he went to the Lord to inquire as to which of the churches was right. In fact, there's a quirky kind of logical problem, it seems to me, here. Because he reads in James chapter 1, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. So he takes that as instruction, okay, well, I'm going to ask God which church is the right church. But why was he confused about all the different denominations? Well, supposedly, he's confused about all the denominations because they all have different interpretations of the Bible. Well, I assume then that if the Baptists and Presbyterians and Methodists all have different Bible interpretations, and that confused Joseph Smith, it follows from that Joseph Smith didn't think that he was in a position to adjudicate the Bible debate, right? In other words, he couldn't say, well, I think the Baptists are right here. He's just saying, the fact that he's confused is a tacit admission that, well, I don't know what it means. And apparently they don't either. Well, then how do you know what James 1:5 meant? When James 1:5 says, if any man lacks wisdom, how do you know that's what that verse meant? Because didn't you just admit you're confused about all these people that have different interpretation? Why is it all of a sudden when it comes to James 1:5, you have absolutely no doubt you think what that meant? Well, if you can know what James 1:5 means, why can't you know what Romans 4 means, or any other verse for that matter? I mean, as a matter of principle. If the principle is supposed to be, there's so many interpretations, who's to say? So let me go to the Bible and see what it tells me to do. Well, wait a minute, I thought going to the Bible was the problem. That everybody's got all their different interpretations. In fact, I got a different interpretation of James 1:5. There's nothing in James 1:5 about asking God whether some denomination is true. That's not even the context, is it? What's the context of that verse? If any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. It's the part where you talk back. Absolutely. It's talking about the suffering that comes in your life, and you're trying to figure out, why am I going through what I'm going through? He says, well, if you don't understand, ask God. He'll tell you why you're going through what you're going through. You can learn from the suffering, so it won't be wasted. You don't have to go through a bunch of suffering, and then you didn't learn a lesson out of it. Now I got to go through it again. It's like, no, man, let me figure this out, and then maybe I don't have to go through second grade. So, at any rate. Another early account revealed in the autumn of 1966 is located in the back of book A1 of the handwritten manuscript of the History of Church and dated around 1835. In this version, so there's no telling when it was added to that history, In this version, the personage that appears to Smith testifies that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. This implies that the personage itself is neither the Father nor the Son. Because in the official version, one of them points to the other and says, "This is my beloved Son." In some version, are angels that he... Well, there it is. In fact, Smith claims that he was visited by many angels. Now, just so you'll know, if you do your studies of other religious movements, some of whom are still in existence today, who were birthed right at the same time in late 19th century, middle to late 19th century America, right from the same geographic area. And then others who have not endured till today, but have more or less fizzled. And see whether there were any other religions that claimed to have a prophet who had visitations from angels or God or whatever, and started a new church, and it was the really true church. This happens several times. In fact, some of the very early people who were with Joseph Smith, who were part of the Mormon movement, left and went to another movement because this person had a visitation. And, well, no, that's the real visitation. And they went and joined this other group. That group ends up kind of petering out and doesn't come to anything, so you figure, man, I jumped off the bandwagon too quick because this one came to naught. A published account of the first vision in the Deseret News, Saturday, May 29th, 1852, does not mention the Father and Son appearing to Smith, but rather refers to angels visiting him. The reference to angels was deleted in later printings to make the reference to be the first visitation rather than to the first visitation of angels. So, in fact, these kind of things where I'm making references to these things here, this stuff still exists. In fact, I have a lot of them in my files. I'll bring it next week, and you can see for yourself photocopies of. I mean, it's not the originals because those are in archives and in libraries, but a lot of it is probably in Salt Lake City. In fact, one of the best resources that I've run across are Gerald and Sandra Tanner. Sandra is a direct descendant of Brigham Young, and they're both multi-generational Mormons. And they got married, they both got saved, they started a ministry to Mormons in Salt Lake City. They owned a microfilm company, so while they still had connections, they began to microfilm. Microfilm was this thing, kids, that back there, you had this machine. Yeah, and then we'd make little microfiche and stuff. And they weren't the only ones doing these, but they had a lot of access to the library there at the Mormon headquarters, where this stuff is archived, and they were able to get it until eventually it came out why they were doing it all. Eventually, the umbilical cord got cut, and but it was sort of the genie was already out of the bottle. I was trying to see how many metaphors I could stick into one paragraph there. The umbilical cord of the genie was out of the bottle while the Lucifer never had a body. Yes, that was his punishment. So he could not exalt into Godhood, nor did any of the other spirit children who sided with him, and they're all demons today. And they're just going straight to perdition. They don't get a body. The rest of us are born in physical bodies so we can go through the progression and be exalted into Godhood. So one more installment. We'll get through this next week.